Hey there, plant lovers. Welcome back to Botanic Haven, your cozy corner of the internet, where we dive deep into everything about gardening, plant care, and creating those stunning green spaces, both inside your home and out in your yard. Today, I want to talk about something absolutely fascinating that's been on my mind for a while now. You know how everyone's talking about plant-based diets and meat alternatives these days? Well, there's this incredible plant that's been around for centuries, packed with protein. Incredibly nutritious, and honestly could replace meat in so many ways. But here's the twist that nobody really talks about. Despite all its amazing qualities, it's becoming harder and harder to find, and fewer farmers are growing it. Sounds strange, right? I mean, if something is so good for us and the planet, why wouldn't everyone be jumping on board to grow it? Stick around because I'm going to share everything I've learned about this mysterious plant, why it's not as popular as it should be, and what we can actually do about it in our own gardens. So let me start by telling you about my friend Daisy. She's been gardening for about 15 years now, mostly vegetables and herbs in her backyard. Last summer, she decided to try something different after reading about protein-rich plants. She planted a whole section of her garden with what we're talking about today, and by the end of the season, she was absolutely amazed. Her family practically stopped buying as much meat because they were getting so much nutrition from these plants. Her kids, who are usually picky eaters, actually enjoyed the meals she made with them. But when she tried to buy more seeds the following spring, she had to search through 5 different suppliers before finding what she needed. That's when she called me, confused and a bit frustrated, asking why something so wonderful was so hard to find. And that conversation sparked this whole deep dive into the topic. The plant I'm talking about is actually a group of plants, really, but I'm focusing mainly on certain legumes and pulse crops that have been cultivated by humans for thousands of years. Think about beans, lentils, chickpeas, and especially some lesser-known varieties that pack even more punch. These plants are nitrogen-fixing miracles that actually improve the soil they grow in. They need relatively little water compared to raising livestock, and they produce seeds that are absolutely loaded with protein, fiber, vitamins, and minerals. Some varieties can give you anywhere from 20 to 35% protein by weight. Compare that to the environmental cost of producing the same amount of protein from beef or pork. And it's not even close. These plants are sustainable, they're healthy, they're versatile in the kitchen, and they can grow in a wide range of climates. Sounds perfect, doesn't it? So why aren't they everywhere? Let me paint you a picture of what's actually happening in agriculture today. Oliver, another gardening buddy of mine, used to work on a commercial farm before he retired and started his own homestead. He told me stories about how farming has changed over the past few decades. The big shift has been toward monoculture, which means growing huge fields of just one crop, usually something like corn, wheat, or soybeans that are subsidized by the government and have guaranteed buyers. These crops are often destined for animal feed, processed foods, or biofuel production. The infrastructure is all set up for them. There are massive processing facilities, transportation networks, and established markets. Farmers know exactly where their harvest will go and how much they'll get paid. But when it comes to some of these amazing protein-rich legumes, especially the heirloom varieties or less common types, the story is completely different. If this guide has helped you, write 1 in the comments. And if not, write 0. This way, I'll know which tips are most useful for your garden. Here's the thing that really gets me. These protein-rich plants actually require more careful handling than many farmers are willing or able to provide in our current system. Take lentils, for example. They're fantastic little powerhouses of nutrition, but they're relatively delicate during harvest. They don't all ripen at exactly the same time, and they're close to the ground, which makes mechanical harvesting tricky. You need specialized equipment, or you need to be willing to do some hand harvesting, which is labor-intensive. In an era where farms are getting bigger and bigger and profit margins are getting tighter and tighter, many farmers simply can't justify the extra effort. They'd rather plant something they can harvest with existing equipment, even if that crop isn't as nutritious or environmentally friendly. It's not that they don't care, it's just the economic reality they're facing. Then there's the market side of things, which is honestly even more complicated. Rose, who runs a small farm stand near where I live, explained this to me in a way that really made sense. She said that most people don't actually know how to cook with many of these protein-rich legumes. Sure, everyone's familiar with black beans or maybe chickpeas if they've had hummus, but ask the average person what to do with mung beans, adzuki beans, or lupini beans, and you'll probably get a blank stare. There's no demand because there's no familiarity, and there's no familiarity because these foods aren't widely available or marketed. It's a vicious cycle. Meanwhile, meat is everywhere, it's advertised constantly, and people grow up learning dozens of ways to prepare it. Breaking through that cultural inertia is incredibly difficult, even when the alternative is healthier and more sustainable. Let me tell you about the economics from the farmer's perspective, because this is really where the rubber meets the road. Imagine you're a farmer with 100 acres of land. You could plant a common crop like field corn, which has a well-established market, predictable yields, and machinery you probably already own. Or you could plant something like pigeon peas or fava beans, which might be more nutritious and better for your soil, but you'd need to find buyers, possibly invest in different equipment, learn new growing techniques, and take on more risk. Most farmers, especially those carrying debt or working on tight margins, simply can't afford to take that gamble. The financial incentives in modern agriculture push people towards safe, conventional choices rather than innovative or healthier ones. And here's another angle that people don't often think about: the seed industry itself. Lucas, who's really into seed saving and heirloom varieties, opened my eyes to this. Most commercial seeds today are controlled by a handful of massive corporations. These companies invest heavily in developing and marketing certain crops while completely ignoring others. They've created seeds that are genetically uniform, optimized for mechanical harvesting, and often resistant to specific herbicides that the same companies also sell. It's a complete package deal. But many of these amazing protein-rich plants, especially heirloom and traditional varieties, don't fit into that model. They're more genetically diverse, they might not respond well to chemical inputs, and they often require different growing practices. The big seed companies haven't invested in them, so they remain obscure, and farmers have fewer resources and less support when trying to grow them. Now let's talk about what this means for your garden, because I don't want this to be all doom and gloom. The beautiful thing about being a home gardener is that you're not bound by the same economic pressures as commercial farmers. You can grow whatever you want, experiment with unusual varieties, and rediscover some of these forgotten protein powerhouses. In fact, growing your own protein-rich legumes might be one of the most rewarding things you do in your garden. I started growing fava beans 3 years ago, and I've never looked back. They're cold hardy, so they can be one of the first things you plant in spring or even in fall in milder climates. They improve the soil for whatever you plant next, and the beans themselves are absolutely delicious, whether you eat them fresh, dried, or even use the greens in salads. Here's my practical advice if you want to get started with these plants. First, figure out what grows well in your climate zone. Not all legumes are suitable for all areas, and some need specific conditions to thrive. Beans generally like warm weather and can't tolerate frost, so they're great for summer gardens. Lentils prefer cooler temperatures and can actually be planted in very early spring or fall. Peas are similar, they love cool weather and will struggle in hot summers. Chickpeas need a longer growing season and moderate temperatures. Do a bit of research or talk to local gardeners to find out what works best where you live. There are so many varieties out there beyond what you see in grocery stores, and some of them might be perfectly suited to your specific conditions. Soil preparation is important but not complicated. Most legumes aren't heavy feeders because they actually create their own nitrogen through those special nodules on their roots that house nitrogen-fixing bacteria. That said, they do appreciate well-drained soil with decent organic matter. I usually add some compost to my beds before planting legumes, but I don't go overboard with nitrogen-rich fertilizers because that can actually discourage the plants from forming those beneficial nitrogen-fixing nodules. The pH should be somewhere between slightly acidic to neutral, around 6 to 7, though different species have slightly different preferences. A simple soil test can tell you where you stand, and it's worth doing if you're serious about growing these crops. When it comes to planting, timing really matters. I learned this the hard way my first year when I planted beans too early and lost the whole crop to a late frost. Now I wait until the soil temperature is consistently above 55 degrees Fahrenheit for warm season beans, and I'm much more successful. For cool season legumes like peas and fava beans, I plant them as soon as the ground can be worked in spring, sometimes even in late winter if conditions allow. The seeds should be planted at a depth about 2 to 3 times their diameter. I like to soak larger beans overnight before planting because it speeds up germination, though some gardeners skip this step with good results. Space them according to the packet instructions, but generally bush varieties need less room than pole varieties. One thing that really makes a difference is inoculating your seeds with the right bacteria if you're planting legumes in a spot where they haven't been grown before. These beneficial bacteria, called rhizobia, form those nitrogen-fixing nodules I mentioned. You can buy inoculant powder at garden centres or online, and it's incredibly cheap. You just dust the seeds with it before planting, and it helps ensure that the plants develop a healthy relationship with the bacteria. I've done side-by-side tests in my garden, and the inoculated plants always outperform the uninoculated ones, especially in new beds. Once you've grown legumes in a spot, the bacteria usually stick around in the soil for future crops. Support structures are necessary for many varieties, especially climbing beans and peas. I've experimented with different trellising methods over the years, and I've found that sturdy structures are worth the investment. Bamboo poles tied together in teepee shapes work great for beans, and they look charming in the garden too. For peas, I use livestock panel sections or chicken wire stretched between posts. The vining varieties will produce much more than bush types, but they need that vertical space. If you're limited on ground space, vertical growing with these plants is actually a fantastic solution. You can pack a lot of production into a small footprint if you go up instead of out. Watering needs vary, but most legumes prefer consistent moisture without being waterlogged. I water deeply but infrequently, encouraging the roots to grow down rather than staying shallow. During flowering and pod development, they need more regular water, so I pay extra attention during those periods. Mulching around the plants helps retain moisture and suppress weeds, which is especially important because many legumes don't compete well with aggressive weeds. I use straw or shredded leaves as mulch, applying it after the plants are a few inches tall. Pest management is usually straightforward with legumes, though you might encounter aphids, bean beetles, or occasionally deer or rabbits if you're in a rural area. I've had good luck with companion planting, putting herbs like rosemary, sage, or marigolds nearby to confuse pests. Hand-picking beetles early in the morning when they're sluggish works well too, or you can use row covers to protect young plants until they're established. I try to avoid pesticides in my garden, even organic ones, unless absolutely necessary. Usually, healthy plants can withstand some pest pressure, and beneficial insects will eventually show up to help balance things out. Harvesting is where it gets really exciting, and the timing depends on how you want to use your legumes. If you want fresh beans or peas, you'll harvest them when the pods are still tender and the seeds inside are plump but not fully mature. These are best eaten right away or blanched and frozen for later. For dried beans and lentils, you let the pods mature completely on the plant until they're dry and papery. Then you harvest the whole plant or individual pods and finish drying them in a protected area with good airflow. I hang mine in my garage for a couple of weeks, then shell them out and store the dried seeds in airtight containers. Properly dried and stored, they'll last for years, giving you a fantastic protein source that you grew yourself. The nutritional benefits of these plants are honestly incredible when you look at the numbers. Take chickpeas, for instance. A cup of cooked chickpeas gives you about 15 grams of protein, 12 grams of fiber, and a good dose of iron, magnesium, and B vitamins. Lentils are similar with about 18 grams of protein per cooked cup, plus tons of folate and manganese. Black beans, kidney beans, and navy beans all fall into similar ranges. Compare that to the 26 grams of protein in a 3-ounce serving of beef. But consider that the beef comes with saturated fat, no fiber, and a massive environmental footprint from water usage, land degradation, and greenhouse gas emissions. When you look at the bigger picture, these plants are remarkable. What I love most about growing these protein-rich plants is the self-sufficiency aspect. Knowing that I have jars of dried beans and lentils that I grew myself, that I can turn into dozens of different meals, gives me a sense of security and satisfaction that's hard to describe. I'm not dependent on grocery stores or supply chains for this portion of my nutrition. And if more people started doing this, even just growing a small amount of their own protein, it would gradually shift demand and maybe, just maybe, encourage more farmers to grow these crops commercially. Every little bit helps, and every garden is a small act of resistance against an industrial food system that doesn't always prioritize health or sustainability. Ivy, my neighbour, started with just one raised bed of beans last year, and this year she's expanded to 3 beds with different varieties of beans, peas and lentils. She told me that her grocery bill has noticeably decreased, and her family is eating more plant-based meals without even really thinking about it. The kids help with the harvesting, which gets them interested in where food comes from, and she's been sharing seeds with other neighbours, spreading the knowledge and the plants themselves. It's exactly this kind of grassroots action that can make a real difference over time. We don't need to wait for big agriculture to change. We can start the change ourselves in our own backyards. Let me also address some common concerns people have about growing these plants. One question I get a lot is whether they're difficult to grow compared to other vegetables. Honestly, in my experience, they're actually easier than many crops. They're not particularly fussy about soil, they create their own nitrogen, they don't need constant fertilizing, and most varieties are pretty resilient. Sure, you might have a learning curve with timing and specific varieties, but that's true of any new plant you try. The key is starting with varieties known to do well in your area and not being afraid to experiment a little. Another concern is cooking and preparation, especially with dried legumes. I get it, they take longer to cook than opening a can, and some people worry about digestibility or that whole issue with beans and gas. But here's the thing. Once you get into a rhythm with cooking dried beans, it's really not complicated. I usually soak them overnight, then cook them in a pot or pressure cooker the next day. You can make big batches and freeze portions for quick meals later. As for digestibility, proper soaking, rinsing and cooking helps break down the complex sugars that cause gas. Adding a piece of kombu seaweed or bay leaves during cooking can help too. And frankly, your digestive system adapts over time if you eat legumes regularly. Your gut bacteria adjust, and the issues that might occur at first usually diminish. From a gardening perspective, these plants also improve your soil for future crops, which is a huge bonus. After I harvest my beans or peas, I cut the plants off at ground level and leave the roots in the soil. Those roots, with their nitrogen-fixing nodules, decompose and release that nitrogen into the soil, essentially fertilizing whatever I plant next. I often follow legumes with heavy feeders like tomatoes, squash or brassicas, and they thrive on the nitrogen left behind. It's like getting free fertilizer while also getting a harvest of nutritious food. That kind of synergy is what makes vegetable gardening so rewarding and sustainable. I want to circle back to why these plants aren't grown more widely, because understanding the problem is the first step to solving it. Beyond the economic and market factors I mentioned, there's also a cultural component. In many Western countries, meat became central to the diet during the post-World War II boom, when it became cheaper and more accessible. It was seen as a sign of prosperity and success. Vegetables, especially beans and legumes, were sometimes viewed as poverty food or what you ate when you couldn't afford meat. That cultural stigma still lingers in subtle ways, even though we now know that plant-based diets are healthier and more sustainable. Changing cultural attitudes takes time, but it happens through education, exposure, and people simply trying new things and realizing they're delicious. There's also the influence of agricultural subsidies, which is a more political topic but worth understanding. In places like the United States, certain crops receive massive government subsidies that make them artificially cheap to grow. Corn and soybeans, much of which goes to animal feed, are heavily subsidized. This distorts the market and makes it harder for other crops to compete economically. A farmer growing subsidized corn has a safety net that a farmer growing heirloom beans simply doesn't have. If subsidies were restructured to support diverse, sustainable crops, including these protein-rich legumes, we'd likely see a shift in what gets grown. But that requires political will and public pressure, which starts with people understanding the issues and demanding change. Now let's get practical again, because I want you to leave this conversation feeling empowered, not overwhelmed. If you're new to gardening or you've never grown legumes before, start small. Pick one variety that sounds interesting and that's appropriate for your climate. Maybe it's snap peas for a cool season crop or green beans for summer. Dedicate a small section of your garden or even just a few containers on a patio. Follow the basic guidelines for planting and care and see what happens. I promise you, when you harvest those first pods and realize you grew your own protein-rich food from seed, you'll be hooked. There's something deeply satisfying about it that goes beyond just the practical benefits. For those of you who are more experienced gardeners, I'd encourage you to branch out into some of the less common varieties. Try growing dried beans specifically for storage. Experiment with lentils or chickpeas if your climate allows. Look into heirloom varieties that have been grown for generations but are now rare. By growing these plants, saving seeds and sharing them with others, you're helping preserve agricultural biodiversity and keeping these genetics alive. You're also learning skills that could become increasingly valuable as our food systems face challenges from climate change, resource depletion, and population growth. Seed saving is something I've become really passionate about over the years. With legumes, it's incredibly easy because they're self-pollinating and the seeds are right there in the pods. At the end of the season, I select the best plants, the ones that were healthiest, most productive, or had the traits I want to encourage. I let some of their pods dry completely on the plant, then I harvest and store those seeds for next year. Over time, you can actually develop strains that are particularly well adapted to your specific garden conditions. It's a slow process, but it's fascinating, and it connects you to thousands of years of human agriculture in a very tangible way. I also want to mention the community aspect of all this. Gardening doesn't have to be a solitary activity, and it's often more rewarding when shared. Seed swaps are becoming popular in many communities, where gardeners get together and exchange seeds, including interesting legume varieties. Online communities and forums are great resources too, where you can ask questions, share successes and failures, and learn from people all over the world. I've gotten some of my best gardening advice and most interesting seeds through these networks. If you're growing these protein-rich plants, share your experience with others. Post pictures, write about it, give away extra seeds. You might inspire someone else to try it, and that ripple effect is how change happens. There's also a therapeutic element to gardening that I think gets overlooked when we focus only on the practical outcomes. Working with plants, getting your hands in the soil, watching something grow from a tiny seed to a productive plant. It's good for mental health. Studies have shown that gardening reduces stress, improves mood, and gives people a sense of purpose and accomplishment. When you're growing food, especially nutritious food that can genuinely sustain you, those benefits are magnified. You're not just growing plants, you're investing in your own well-being and resilience. Let me share one more story that really drives home why this matters. I met a couple at a gardening workshop a few years ago who had started growing their own food after facing financial difficulties. They couldn't afford to buy much meat, so they planted beans, peas, and lentils in their small urban backyard. Within a few months, they were harvesting enough to significantly supplement their diet. They learned to make bean burgers, lentil soups, chickpea curries, and all sorts of dishes they'd never tried before. Not only did it help their budget, but they both reported feeling healthier, having more energy, and actually enjoying food more because they'd grown it themselves. That experience transformed how they thought about food, gardening, and their own capabilities. Now they teach workshops helping others in their community do the same thing. That's the kind of impact we're talking about here. This isn't just about plants or nutrition or environmental sustainability, though those are all important. It's about empowerment and resilience and community. It's about taking back some control over one of the most fundamental aspects of our lives, what we eat. When you grow your own protein-rich plants, you're participating in something much bigger than just gardening. You're challenging an industrial food system that often doesn't serve our best interests. You're reducing your environmental impact, you're improving your health, and you're learning skills that you can pass on to others. So why aren't these plants grown more widely? Because the current system doesn't incentivize them. Because cultural inertia is powerful. Because economic pressures push farmers towards safe, subsidized crops. Because the infrastructure for processing and distributing them isn't well developed. Because most people don't know how to cook with them or even know they exist. But none of those reasons are insurmountable. They're all things we can work to change, starting in our own gardens and spreading outward from there. I truly believe we're at a turning point where more and more people are questioning the way our food system works and looking for alternatives. The interest in plant-based eating, regenerative agriculture, and food sovereignty is growing. Young people especially are eager to learn these skills and reconnect with where their food comes from. The knowledge is out there, the seeds are available if you know where to look, and the techniques aren't difficult to learn. What's needed is for more people to actually try it, to plant those seeds and see what happens. Here's my challenge to you. This season, grow at least one protein-rich legume variety. It doesn't matter if it's in a huge garden plot or a single container on your balcony. Experience the process from seed to harvest. Learn what that plant needs, how it grows, and what it can provide. Then share what you learned with someone else. Cook a meal with your harvest and invite friends over. Save some seeds and give them away. Write about it on social media or just tell your neighbors. Every single person who discovers these plants and starts growing them is a small victory against a food system that needs to change. As we wrap up here, I want to leave you feeling hopeful and motivated rather than discouraged. Yes, there are systemic problems with how we grow and distribute food. Yes, these amazing plants aren't as popular as they should be. But we have the power to change that, one garden at a time. You don't need to solve all the world's problems or revolutionize agriculture single-handedly. You just need to plant some seeds, nurture them, harvest them, and share what you've learned. The rest will follow naturally from there. Thank you so much for joining me today here at Botanic Haven. I hope this conversation has given you some food for thought, maybe inspired you to try something new in your garden, and helped you understand why these incredible plants deserve more attention than they get. If you have questions or want to share your own experiences with growing protein-rich plants, please drop a comment. I love hearing from you all, and we learn so much from each other's experiences. Until next time, happy gardening, and remember that every plant you grow is making the world a little bit better.